shows that there is absolutely no damage to any bone. The bullet was not deflected off the bone in the president's body, which becomes very important when you try to reconstruct the flight path. The wound that was in evidence when the autopsy photographs were taken is far too large. Dr. Perry told me in 1978 that this is not the way he left the wound. That it was left, as he said, inviolate. In other words, after the tracheotomy was performed, he performed no further surgery, and it was not in this condition when he left the body. During the autopsy, a bullet described as a missile was signed for by Secret Service agent, FBI agents Siebert and O'Neill. It was signed for, it was removed from the president's body during the autopsy, but it was never placed into evidence. This could have been the one removed from the throat, or it could have been removed from the throat prior to this point. In any case, the president has been hit once. Governor Connolly at this point has not been hit. He is calm, he is at ease, displays no discomfort. The president obviously has been. And it's at this point where the president appears to be struck again. This time from behind. When you measure the president, now sitting totally erect, against the handhold of the cart which is behind him, and watch between this and the next two frames, we'll go over this a few times, he is pushed violently downward and forward. Again, transfer of momentum. We see the same response to Governor Connolly a few seconds later, but watch the president at this point. Forward and downward. Do that again. This whole sequence takes far less than 1 second. 2 shots and Governor Connolly isn't hit yet. Now, this bullet was supposed to be coming down from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But we saw at the point where the president was hit, he was sitting erect. He was not forward, as in this diagram done by the House Assassination Committee. The point where the tracheotomy was, the point where the back wound was. As Professor Thompson showed last night, very eloquently, this could not have come down from the 6th floor. If anything, it was an upward trajectory, had the front and rear wounds been related. I maintain, as the doctors originally did, that they are not. The point of the wound in the president's back was shown in Dr. Boswell's drawing on the autopsy face sheet. It was about 5 inches below the shoulder line. The entrance wound in the president's back in the jacket absolutely concurs, as does the shirt. The autopsy photograph of the president showing the back wound. The wound is not in the neck. It is in the back. This is very, very important. If that bullet entered the back, it could not have come out through the president's throat. It did not hit bone, as the doctors still testify to. This wound could not have been an exit wound from the front. It is a small deep puncture wound, exactly as the one described prior to the tracheotomy. This is the point where Governor Connolly is hit. Now, the president has responded to 2 shots already. Governor Connolly, the line of the shoulder. Between this frame and the next, the shoulder drops. His cheeks puff out. His hair becomes disheveled. There is no question this is the point where he was hit. This is where he says he was hit. 3 separate shots. Not even counting the one that missed at the beginning. We have now 4 shots. According to the Warren Commission, only one could have been fired. This is the point where Governor Connolly was hit in his back, where it says in shoot. This is where his shirt shows the entrance wound and the exit wound. The description: entering the back, exiting the chest, entering and exiting the wrist, and finally entering his left thigh. Governor Connolly was holding a Stetson hat in his hand, broad-brimmed Stetson hat. This is 2.5 seconds after he was hit in the back. So I don't want to get into your territory on this, but the distal radius bone was fractured. It was fractured. We have the X-ray there. Not at this point, I'll say, but during the shooting sequence, it was. There is not a single drop of blood on the cuff of the shirt. I maintain that Governor Connolly was not hit in the wrist yet, but was hit by yet another bullet later on, as we'll see when we see the film in motion. He's still holding that Texas Stetson hat in his hand. The tendon to the thumb necessary for holding this was severed. He could not have held that hat 2.5 seconds after being struck, and by now there would certainly be considerable amount of blood on the cuff or somewhere near it. There is absolutely none. Now, Governor Connolly, when he testified, said he knew he had been hit in the back. It felt like a doubled-over fist slamming him in the back. But he was not aware that he'd been shot either in the right wrist or the left thigh. Seems kind of curious. Certainly would have hurt a little bit. The question is, why didn't he know about it? I maintain that he went into shock after being hit in the back from the pain and the realization of what was going on. He started to black out. He blacked out before he received the secondary wounds. The Warren Commission, the FBI, the Dallas Police, the Secret Service, they all knew the entrance points for President Kennedy and Governor Connolly. They knew it. This photograph was taken for the government agencies and given to the Warren Commission. They elected not to publish it. The reason why becomes very clear when you need a single bullet theory. When you draw a straight line between the entrance wounds, there is absolutely no correlation for a throat wound. That throat wound, which the Warren Commission said was an exit wound, for the entrance wound here, simply was not an exit wound and had no relationship to this shot at all. And they knew it. Knowing the point that President Kennedy was hit, if indeed this was an entrance and this was an exit, it would not have gone on to hit Governor Connolly up here. It would have gone straight through since it didn't hit bone, was not deflected. It would have missed Governor Connolly completely. It's more likely to have hit Mrs. Connolly in the lower right side back area or the buttock area, or missed completely. So we now have two wounds. We have a wound in the back, 5 3/4 inches below the shoulder line, and we have one from the grassy knoll area from the right front. You can see in this diagram, it's just the same angle the President was sitting at in the car. They're coming down from the 6th floor. There is no way in the world a bullet could have struck here. It would have traveled on down, unless it hit bone and was deflected up, and then traveling up, it certainly couldn't have gone on to hit Governor Connolly. Plus the fact that we have a bullet traveling on a right to left trajectory, Governor Connolly's right shoulder was far to the right of the point of exit, or quote exit, in the President's throat. Very strange wound. It's not a knee puncture wound as you expect round, but a rather bizarre shape. But it did exit. The wound was probed and was found not to traverse the body. The wound was a shallow one, as I mentioned before. Had the bullet path gone further into the body, had it been traceable to go through, had the autopsy been done correctly, it would have been traced downward. Somehow, if the bullet did not fall out prior to the autopsy, then it had to be somewhere in the President's body. That could have been the one that was signed for by Siebert and O'Neill. Well, in order to make the shot from the 6th floor window fit, they performed what I call verbal plastic surgery. They told us that the wound was in the President's neck, in the back of the neck. They then lowered the point of exit to this point, when originally it was up here. The man who drew this, a gentleman named Rydberg, who was a corpsman for the armed services, drew this based specifically on the downward angle as given to him from the depository. And the nature of the wounds is described to him. He was not allowed to see the autopsy photographs. The Warren Commission had the autopsy photographs available to them and elected not to look at them. The death certificate of President Kennedy, signed by his own personal physician, Dr. Berkeley, says a second wound occurred in the posterior back at about the level of the third thoracic vertebra. Again, about 5 to 5 3/4 inches below the shoulder line. They had all of this evidence and still put the wound in the back of the president's neck. And which fabulous bullet, unique in all the world, could have performed 7 separate wounds to 2 grown men, shattering 2 of the densest bones in Governor Connolly's body. Here it is, the magic bullet, CE-399, Commission Exhibit 399. In such good shape, it could darn near be fired again. The only damage we see here, looking at it this way, is a small bit missing from the head. But that didn't happen during the shooting. Those were little cuts taken by the FBI for spectrographic analysis. There is a slight flattening to the tail, and when we look at the tail, we find more damage, but this damage, again, was done by the FBI, taken out for spectrographic analysis. There is, in this container, a fragment. This fragment was taken from Governor Connolly's wrist and weighs more than the total weight missing from that bullet. This does not take into consideration other fragments, anything could have been lost anywhere along the way, or fragments that are still in Governor Connolly's leg to this day, still have not been removed. As Professor Thompson said last night, the bullet that was found and handed over to a police officer was described as having a pointed nose. Carcano ammunition is round nose. The bullet that was found by a stretcher or on a stretcher in the hospital in Parkland by Darrell Tomlinson and then turned over to the police was switched for a Carcano bullet. That seems quite obvious. A bullet under controlled circumstances doing far less damage than the single bullet theory would show this as a minimal degree of deformity. A great many of the other test bullets fired had a great deal more. Some of them actually split apart, where the lead core actually separated from the copper jacket. Anyway, the car moves down the street. There have been 4 shots so far. They've all been non-fatal. The president is 3/4 of the way out of the plaza, and he's still alive. If there were a conspiracy, and if there were more than one gunman, these men are panicking now because they're blowing them. Until this point. The end of the second volley, the end of the first volley of shots was at about frame 237, 236, somewhere in that area. By 3:13, the rifles have all been recycled and ready to fire. This is frame 312 of the Zapruder film, the last frame before the fatal headshot or shots, depending on whether there were 1 or 2 hits, and there may very well have been 2 simultaneously. Next frame, the president is struck in the head. Massive explosion. It appears that the explosion only went forward. This is an illusion. We see a pie-shaped shadow here. This is a shadow caused by the sun, which was at the other end coming this way, casting a shadow. What's left of the president's head is casting a shadow on the explosion. So that which is down here, which would normally appear, and which does show in mixed film from the other side of the street, doesn't appear at this point. This is an illusion. It actually does come down to this side as well. Skull fragments are driven upward and rearward. Parts of the president's brain were thrown to the rear as well. But the president himself was thrown to the rear. Now, as Professor Thompson mentioned last night, from the point where the president is struck here at 312 to 313, there is a slight forward motion for 1 frame. But then we see an explosion and a violent change in this direction. 180 degrees to the rear. The president is thrown downward, backward, and to the left. at the point where the president is hit, now this is an exact photograph, totally unretouched. What it shows is the angle of the president when he was struck. He was sitting slightly forward. However, to make that bullet from the 6th floor, given the downward angle, fit, Corporal Ripper had to so distort the president's head forward to make that entrance wound, which was described as being just above the hairline, fit an exit wound. Now this doesn't take into consideration the fact that the bullet is supposed to be traveling right to left, and we have him here traveling left to right. But if the president were sitting at the point where we know he was, given the nature of the so-called wounds as described in the autopsy, the bullet came from ground level or below. This is the angle of the president. That's the degree of distortion just to make the bullet wounds fit. Clearly, if those wounds are correct, they did not come from the depository. Well, the Warren Commission didn't bother with it because we weren't supposed to see the autopsy photographs. We were allowed to see this rather foolish drawing. Again, the wound in the neck, somewhat enlarged. It's a lot larger than a bullet hole would be. But they knew better. During the government recreations, they pointed to where the wounds were, as I said before, in the backs, but they also knew where the wound was in the back of the head, and they highlighted it. This is, again, before the creation of the single bullet theory, and without thinking that, in fact, the exit wound in the head was so much higher. This is the approximate point where the president was supposed to have been hit in the back of the head. Well, it didn't fit. When Commander Humes testified to the Warren Commission, to the House Assassination Committee, he originally described an entrance wound near the base of the head at this point, down here. Exactly where we see a small piece of brain oozing out. The House Committee, on the other hand, said that there was an entrance wound up here in the cowlick area. In other words, it moved out about 100 millimeters or about 4 inches. They ignore this and say it's a small piece of brain lying in the hair just above the hairline. And they moved it from the external occipital protuberance up to this point. This then became the in-shoot wound, and that's the out-shoot wound. This more closely fits the shot from the depository on a vertical plane, but it still doesn't explain how a right-to-left trajectory entering the rear didn't exit here on the left side of the face. This became their official version. The one honest thing, perhaps the only honest thing to come out of the House assassination hearings, is that they put the wound in the back where it actually was and took it away from the neck. But they lied, and they knew they were lying, as I'll show you, about the entrance wound in the rear of the head. This became their version. But once again, this bullet is traveling left to right. The depository was on the right side. Entering this point, it would have exited from the left side of the president's face. There is no bony material within the president's head to make this bullet deflect. Now this is the actual autopsy photograph showing the rear of the head, or what purports to be the actual autopsy photograph. That small bit of brain material there, and the entrance wound in the cowlick area. It's kind of difficult to see in black and white because there's no margin to this alleged wound. The lighting is coming from the side, yet we see no edge, no border. In the autopsy diagram, Commander Boswell, Dr. Boswell, describes pie-shaped cuts and damages to the rear of the head, several fractures in the rear of the head, indicating perhaps an exit wound. The word missing is drawn here. Now, it's not clear whether missing responds to this massive fall in the president's head or whether it refers with an arrow down to this point. It is just not particularly clear. But what is clear is the fact that fracture is shown quite clearly. The motorcycle riders that were riding to the president's left were splattered with blood and brain and skull fragment. One so severely that he himself thought he had been shot. Again, this is in line with a shot between the grassy knoll of the president and the motorcycle suppository. This is the president's x-ray. This is x-ray of the skull. I'm not a medical expert, but there is some apparent damage up to here somewhere, one would think. But in the rear, we seem to see an avulsion, but appears to be an exit type area in the exact spot that we'll be discussing in a moment. This is an x-ray enhanced by computer. We can't tell what this area shows because it's been cropped out. Why? They're going to show this and present this as evidence, and they show the fracture in the front. Why eliminate the exit to the rear? I think the answer will become quite clear. Every doctor, every nurse, Mrs. Kennedy herself, all describe exactly the same exit wound in the rear of the president's head. It was an avulsed, exploded out wound of the occipital area, right in here. It was described that cerebellar tissue was protruding.
Can we have the lights on, please?
Take a break.
Sorry, it's okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Lights.
We have to take a break.
Sorry.
I was saying from slide for Okay, let's carry on.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's carry on.
Please, all right.
An exit wound occurred in this area, according to every one of the doctors. Cerebellar tissues, which appears only in the lower rear of the head, was protruding from this wound. The official exit wound to the top or temporal area of the head simply would not protrude this type of matter. This is the president before and after the point of impact. The first one is frame 312, the second one is frame 335. The president between point A and point B was struck, thrown to the rear of the car, bounced off the seat, and then headed forward in nearly the same position as he started, but a little bit over toward his left. The original rear line of the head is in this area. You follow that same line down over here, but now you have a new avulsed area to the rear of the head, but appears to be the exact exit wound described by the doctors. It's in exactly the same spot. There's damage to the right temporal area with a skin flap pushed forward with skull still attached to it. The top of the president's head is this dark brown area up here where the hair is left. This up here is Mrs. Kennedy's shoulder. And here's the rear line of the head, the ear. But this is the whole new avulsed, open rearward point, which exactly matches what the doctors said. That there was a wound to the rear of the president's head, large enough to stick your fist through. And another frame showing the exact same exit area. Well, the Zapruder film is not unique in showing this evidence, but a fragment was found 35 feet to the left and rear from the point of impact on the president. It was blown backwards. It was found by a young man named Billy Harper, who was originally described as being from the occipital area of President Kennedy. The Nix film taken from the other side of the street shows us proof of what the Zapruder film showed. It was not an illusion. This is the frame just before the president was struck in the head. As a matter of fact, it is actually striking at this point. We see the explosion begin, and then 1/18 of a second later, we have the same exit point in the rear on the Nix film. This is exactly what the doctors said, and as we'll see in a moment, this is what Mrs. Kennedy said. Every one of them. Josiah Thompson, in 6 Seconds in Dallas, published the statements of all of these doctors describing this wound. We'll spend a little more time on this in just a moment. From the point of impact, there is a light in the area that is traveling at very high speed towards the rear. This may be, somewhere in here may be the harbor fragment that was blown to the rear. And an enlargement of the same frame. As I pointed out before, there is no margin to this alleged wound. This looks like a small piece of blood just lying there. It's within the head. Josiah Thompson spoke to the doctors. He was the first one to speak to any of them. And they described this exit wound. Exactly this. This is an accurate description of what the president's head looked like. It is absolutely and totally consistent with... Is it possible to turn this slide out, please? This is consistent with what the doctors spoke about.
Wouldn't that have shown up on the previous picture, previous frame?
How do you mean?
Wouldn't we have seen that on the previous picture? This is just that up short.
That's a very good point, and that's exactly what I'm getting at. Why does this not show? How could all of the doctors be wrong? I'm not talking about one or two, but between the medical personnel and Mrs. Kennedy, we have something like 26 individual testimonies, all relating to this exit wound. There is not a single holdout. Nobody gave conflicting testimony. They all said the same thing. The other night, Nova ran a TV show. 3 of the doctors, actually 4 of the doctors were questioned about it. They all described the wound before going in and being allowed to see the autopsy photographs. They were faced with the dilemma of deciding whether the president's body had been altered, as was charged by a critic, David Lipton. They described before going in and viewing these autopsy photographs, which they had never been allowed to see before officially. They all described, as Dr. McClellan did, an exit wound exactly where Professor Thompson's picture showed it, and exactly where the Zapruder film says it was. Dr. Delaney said the same thing, as did Dr. Peters. But they're not unique. Between myself, Harrison Livingstone, and David Lipton, we have spoken to nearly every one of the doctors. And every one of them said exactly the same thing, that the exit wound was in the rear of the head. There wasn't a single holdout. The only one who began to change before seeing the photographs was Dr. Jenkins, who placed it just slightly forward, but not anywhere near where the autopsy photograph shows it to be. This is from a drawing done by Ida Docks for the House Committee. This is from the actual photograph. In the photograph, you might not even see this in orange circle. You couldn't find it. This is considerably larger than that. But notice in the Docks drawing how well this wound is pointed out. Here it looks like a hole. It's dark, it's black, no light is reflecting off of it. But in the actual photograph, it reflects light. It's at the surface. Why does this happen, as the gentleman just asked? Very simply, it appears that the autopsy photographs themselves showing the rear of the president's head have been altered. Mechanically altered using a technique called mat insertion. As you can see from back there, let me try to focus this a little better down there at the bottom. Beyond the edge of this area, going down toward the edge and to the outside margin, the air is totally dry. Not a single drop of moisture or wetness. Within this point, it's all sopping wet. When you look at these photographs were taken with a handheld camera on a 4x5 transparency film and black and white negative film. They were handheld. When the photographer took these, he took them slightly farther apart, side to side, creating, in effect, what a viewmaster does, creates stereo views. When you reduce these in size and look at them in stereo views, you see the president's head in 3 dimensions. What you see around the outside, the ear, the neck, Everything outside of here, everything aligns with your eye. You see a true three-dimensional image. But when you get to this area, within this point, it appears flat. It appears inconsistent. Especially when you get to this darkened area in here, where it would be very difficult to try to retouch. Very, very difficult to do. The eye feels totally discomfortable. You cannot make this line up to the eye. I maintain these photographs were created very soon after the assassination because if it were known that an exit wound did indeed exist in the rear of the president's head, proving a shot from the front and an exit to the rear, we would then have the problem of conspiracy, which the Warren Commission and the government would never allow. Mrs. Kennedy, immediately after the shooting, in such a shock reaction she doesn't even remember doing this, climbs out onto the rear deck of the car, not to escape, as the official cover-up story was, not to help Clint Hill onto the back of the car, the Secret Service agent, because she did not look over her shoulder first, had no way of knowing he was even coming. But she reaches out, she braces herself with her left hand, reaches out with her right hand, picks something up that has been blown to the rear and brings it back into the car. According to Governor Connolly, her testimony was, "They've killed him, I've got his brains in my hand." She picked up a piece of brain material, brought it into the car. As you see, she started in by herself. He never touched her, never pushed her back in. That was absolutely untrue. And she said in her testimony, describing herself as trying to hold his hair on. From the front there was nothing, but from the rear you could see, or from the back you could see, you know, you were trying to hold his hair on and his skull on. From the back. The very best witness, Mrs. Kennedy, said exactly the same things that all the doctors did. By the way, that last page of testimony was not published by the Warren Commission. They withheld it. When you look at Mrs. Kennedy's testimony, she's describing about seeing the overpass in front of her and thinking about how cool it's going to be in the shadows underneath the underpass. And then a little notation, same line, same typeface, no separation, no indication, no parenthesis, no underline. He says, all reference to wounds deleted. And the next line, thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, we appreciate you coming and spending your time. They did not want anyone to see this testimony. This is one reason why, because this is the reference to the wounds, and the wounds, the best witness to the wounds, Mrs. Kennedy and the doctors, of course, were not published. There's also a very interesting point here, which, not dealing with Governor Connolly in any particular way, but it says here, Governor Connolly screamed like a stuffed pig, which is not exactly a comment that you would want to mention, but it's an extremely important point, because as she's testifying here, she was confused. The president was hit and made absolutely no sound. Well, the voice box would have been involved in the shooting, the shot from the front. So he couldn't speak. He was making no sound, but Governor Connolly was screaming. As you see in the film, as we'll see when you watch it in motion, Mrs. Kennedy is distracted by Governor Connolly screaming. But what she said was that had she realized what was going on, she could have pulled her husband out of the way and Governor Connolly would have been hit by the last bullet. But indeed, that didn't happen. As Mrs. Kennedy went back into the car, Clint Hill was on the back, heading for the triple railroad underpass. We noticed something which has yet been unrealized. We had mentioned before that Governor Connolly was hit in the wrist, and there's no blood 2.5 seconds after he was hit in the back. When then was he actually hit? This is after the president has been thrown to the rear. It's about frame 321. Governor Connolly is still sitting erect. But just a few frames later, he was struck by a fourth shot. Now, why is it a fourth shot that the House Committee admitted to? Let me get into this just for a moment. Trying to correlate the shot numbers is very, very difficult because there's so many different versions of it. We had 4 shots before the headshot. If there was indeed a double headshot causing that double motion that we saw, then we have 6. And then we have Governor Connolly hit by yet another, which creates 7. And we know of one more that missed that struck a bystander, James Tate, and we'll deal with him in a little while, which was a possible total of 8 shots. Now, it's possible that somewhere along the line, one of the other shots caused the damage to the curb and Mr. Tate, and there's other evidence of perhaps other shots missing within the closet. But at this point, Governor Connolly is still sitting up. And in the film, when you see this, during at least one of the showings of the film, try to watch Governor Connolly instead of the president. Watch what happens to him as he's thrown violently forward and rolls over in the seat in just a few frames. You actually see him like almost pushed forward, rolled over. He can't see, he's been shot, and he's hit again and thrown forward. As evidenced here. The car then goes on to the triple underpass and on to the Stemmes Freeway, on to Barton Hospital, in a vain attempt to save the president's life. This photograph was taken on the other side of this little hill. There's the railroad tower up in the top that's behind the Texas School Book Depository. Well, immediately after the shooting, a great deal of attention was given to the area of the Texas School Book Depository, and there was a couple of reasons why. Within the plaza and with the hundreds of witnesses that were there, two of the witnesses saw what appeared to be a rifle shape in the 6th floor window, the easternmost window. And attention was drawn to it. And the police went up there and they found what appears to be a sniper's nest or a barricade made of the book boxes. Beyond that barricade is the sniper's nest, the gun rest, if you will. This is the official version of the way they looked. Try to note that in your mind for a moment as you look at yet another official version. Both of these are labeled to be the condition and position of the boxes during the shooting. Neither of them is quite accurate. There are something like 8 different definitions of how the boxes were. It's impossible to try to reconstruct this. From the inside, anyway, you have a better idea from the outside, the photographs taken immediately after the shooting. But with the window closed to the height that it was closed at the time of the shooting, if this particular official version had been true, if you rested the gun on the gun rest and looked through the telescopic sight, you'd get a great shot at the bottom of the window sash. You couldn't have seen anything. A rifle, as I said, was found on the opposite end of the depository. And it was found by, depending on which version you believe, it was either found by Eugene Boone or by Seymour Weitzman. Seymour Weitzman seems to be the most likely candidate. And the rifle that he found, because he was a gun collector and worked in the gun store and he knew his business, was a 7.65 millimeter Mauser bolt-action equipped with a .418 sight. This man knew what he was talking about. Another weapon was allegedly found in the depository. This is somewhat nebulous. We're not sure whether this actually was or not. The caption, the assassin's weapon, did not come from me. It came from the film in which this appeared. It's called
Kennedy's Final Hour.
Kennedy's Final Hour, thank you. It's known as the DC-8 film, Dallas Cinema Associates. And these policemen and detectives and sheriffs are all gathered around talking to this witness. And either the witness or this policeman, most likely this policeman, is holding this rifle in his hand. It may be a rifle, it may be a scattergun, but it's rather interesting that it's there. There were other reports of other rifles. At any rate, the Mauser disappears, and what is found is a 6.5 millimeter Italian carbine. Amateur Carcano, allegedly ordered from Fine Sporting Goods in Chicago by one Alec James Hidell. Now Hidell, or Hidell, was Oswald's alias. When he was arrested, he found identification for both Oswald and Hidell in his pocket, in his wallet. But the rifle was removed from the depository and tested. For 3 days it was tested and found not to have any finger or palm prints anywhere on it. After Lee Oswald died, the rifle was brought to the mortuary. There were witnesses to this. And then all of a sudden, they found a smudged palm print on the rifle. I mean, that's pretty obvious what happened there. Anyway, how would Oswald have gotten the rifle into the building? Well, according to the testimony of the young fellow who drove in there, Buell Wesley Frazier, who drove in there that morning, Oswald was carrying a package. Frazier asked Oswald, "What do you have in that package?" He said, "Curtain rods." When Frazier Frazier parked his car. Oswald walked into the depository with his package, and the package was cupped between his armpit and his palm. He was holding it comfortably against his body. Even when you break a rifle down into two parts, as small as you can get it, it is still longer than the distance between Oswald's armpit and his palm. The afternoon of the assassination, an enterprising reporter and photographer went out to the rooming house where Oswald had lived. And he went around the building and he saw the room where Oswald had been staying in the Oak Cliff area and shot some photographs through the window and saw Earlene Roberts, the landlady, indeed hanging the curtain rods that Oswald had said was in that package. Oswald did leave the depository after the shooting and did go home. That's the bag. A rifle was supposed to be in this bag, yet there isn't a single point anywhere on this bag where the rifle dimensions have left any kind of impression. There's not a single drop of gun oil anywhere within this bag. Well, a lot of attention was drawn to that window. This is a series of slides that we're going to get to at the end of the presentation. This is some very new evidence and quite startling. I'll just pass by it for now. Oswald left the 6th floor. 72 to 90 seconds, or close to probably to 72 seconds, he was seen by the depository superintendent, Roy Truly, and a police officer who saw him calmly drinking a Coca-Cola in the 2nd floor lunchroom. Oswald left the depository, and although it's hotly debated how he got here, he ended up on North Beckley Avenue. This is where he had a rooming house. He rented a room in this house. This is what I was telling you about with the curtain rods. The Warren Commission gives this convoluted route of getting onto a bus being stuck in traffic, and getting out, getting into a cab after offering the cab to another lady who was in a hurry to get it, and then traveling to Oak Cliff, traveling a few blocks beyond the rooming house, getting out, and then walking back. Going in, changing his shirt, picking up a pistol, and then leaving. Mrs. Roberts, the landlady, testified that while Oswald was there, a police car drove up in front of the house, honked his horn a few times. She looked out, saw it was a police car, noted the number of the car. The car then took off and left. Then Oswald left, walked across the street, was standing there as if waiting for the bus. She then returned to her TV set to watch what was happening after the assassination. Some blocks from the point where Oswald had a rooming house, a police officer pulled up by the side of a road, allegedly to question a man who was walking, allegedly through an open window on the right side of the police car, although the police car here has the window totally closed, and no one has said that they had closed that window. At any rate, the official version was that Officer J.B. Tippett, Jefferson Davis Tippett, was shot to death by Lee Harvey Oswald. Linking these two crimes together made it easy for the Warren Commission to say, and specifically one David Bellin, who is an attorney, one of the few existing, nearly extinct apologists for the Warren Commission, said that the shooting of Officer Tippett is a Rosetta Stone to the Kennedy case. He says, Oswald shot Tippett, therefore he shot President Kennedy. There is no evidence linking Oswald with either crime that I think would stand up in a court of law. But in any case, they said that Oswald shot Tippett. Well, that's what they said. That's not what any of the witnesses said originally. Every one of the witnesses originally said that it was somebody else, particularly Nicola Clemens. Now, she was told by official-looking characters that if she wanted to stay healthy, she'd better keep her mouth shut. She didn't, just once, and she gave a critic, Mark Lane, an interview with Movie Rush to Judgment. And in it she said that she saw two people, not one, that were involved in the killing. She said the man who fired the shot was heavy-set and had close-cropped curly hair, not Lee Harvey Oswald. Mrs. Clemens has disappeared. We don't know where she is. we have not been able to find during nearly, I guess, 20 years. Several other witnesses, Domingo Benavides, Warren Reynolds, a great many others, all originally said it was not Oswald. One was shot in the head, survived, and changed his story. Another had his twin brother shot to death in the bar. He then changed his story. The pattern is consistent. Anyway, Lee Harvey Oswald is found at the Texas school in the Texas Theater, allegedly for sneaking in. We have a situation where the president has been shot, a police officer has been shot, and half the Dallas Police Department ends up at the theater to arrest a man who's snuck in without paying. Here's Oswald actually being arrested. By the way, when Oswald was arrested, he had easily enough money to avoid every ticket for the entire theater. That's a slight exaggeration. He easily could have paid, not drawing attention to himself. It does not make sense that he would have done this. There is new testimony which will be released very soon, I hope, of people that have not been questioned before relating to Oswald entering the theater. Anyway, he is arrested. He's taken out, violently protesting. The way he was arrested was rather strange. Johnny Calvin Brewer, a young man who was working in a shoe store down the block, saw, allegedly, a man sneaking into the theater, and civic-minded as he was, left the store and ran across the street, told the lady at the ticket counter, someone just snuck into your theater, you better call the police. And he went inside, said this guy looked awfully suspicious. But of course, Brewer didn't pay to get inside, did he? At any rate, he's in there and he's waiting. The police come and they throw him against the wall, saying, you know, he said, no, I'm the one who said, call you. I saw somebody sneak in, he was suspicious. So they bring him out on stage, right in front, much as I'm standing in front of you. They turn off the projector, they turn on the house lights, and he looks out and he says, there's your man, he's the one you want, pointing to Lee Harvey Oswald sitting right near the back of the theater. Well, the obvious thing to do would be to go and find this guy and get him before he's ready to run away. However, the police start at the front row. They risk everybody saving him for last. Obviously hoping he's going to get up and try to run so he could be accidentally struck by the warning shot. Oswald calmly sat there, and as they approached him, he stood up and said, this is it. Allegedly drew his gun, which may or may not have happened. He probably did. Attempted to fire at Officer Nick McDonald. McDonald was shot. It's a well-publicized story. As the trigger was pulled, it hit the little weapon between the thumb and forefinger and misfired. Oswald then decked McDonald, and he was then pounced upon by several other policemen who subdued him, and he's shouting at the top of his lungs, I am not resisting arrest, I am not resisting arrest, police brutality. Anyway, he was arrested. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Well, we're entering a point now where Jack White is going to take over for a little while, relating to these photographs taken and found of Lee Harvey Oswald, or allegedly of Lee Harvey Oswald, in his backyard. Jack? Gary, switch that? We'll get to the assassination film itself in a while. We'll save that for the end so that you can see it in its entirety without being disturbed by other things around it. Jack White will talk about the backyard photographs, and we'll take a little bit of break, and we'll come back to the rest of the presentation. 10 minutes. 10 minute break, yes. 10 minute break. We don't want to hold